All right. So who in here likes puzzles? Anybody like puzzles like we just did? I mean, I like puzzles, or I think a more accurate thing to say is I like the idea of puzzles, but the actual process of putting together a puzzle can be like incredibly frustrating for me. Because I don't know about you, but when I do puzzles, kind of like the people in our game, there are moments where like I just get fixated on a certain thing in a puzzle. Have you ever had this like where there's like one piece you just need to find, or just like a few pieces that you just can't move on to the puzzle without finding these few things? Like for instance, about a month or so ago at Christmas, Leanne and I were putting together a 1,000-piece puzzle. And like my thing that I was going to do was put together the edge of the puzzle, all the border pieces. And so I start searching through, and as I'm like putting this thing together, like I can't find some of the edge pieces. They're just missing, like as if the box just didn't come with all the pieces. And so I go searching and searching. Like I count through all 1,000 pieces of this puzzle like 3 different times. I spend nights doing this, just searching for these pieces. Eventually, like I get so fed up, like I start searching under the table. I go through the laundry. I search the entire house. I go through all my staff's stuff. Like I'm just trying to find these pieces of this puzzle. And I'm just fixated, and I can't think about anything but these things. And do you ever have that moment where that kind of happens in your life too? Like whatever's going on in life, you've got a problem, and you just can't think about anything other than that problem. Especially when you're afraid of something. Like when you're afraid, sometimes you get so fixated on what it is you're afraid of that you just can't think about anything else. Like if you've got some sort of sickness or something wrong with your body or a spot on you and you don't know what it is and you're afraid of what it might be, and you just can't think about anything else other than what's wrong with your body, right? Or maybe if you go through a situation where you are in some sort of a breakup and your relationship is falling apart and you just can't think about anything but that breakup. It just consumes your mind. Or you're studying for a test and you feel like you don't know the answers and you just can't think about anything but that test and how afraid you are that you're going to fail. Or maybe you've told a lie and you're afraid that people are going to find out, and that just consumes your mind. A lot of times when we are afraid of something, that fear can consume us. And the interesting thing about it is that sometimes that fear causes us to stop things. Right? Sometimes we're so afraid of things it almost paralyzes us, and we just hole up and close ourselves inside, and we don't let people know what we're afraid of. We don't let them know that we're suffering, and we just try to keep it all secret. Or other times, it will manifest itself by causing us to do things we never thought we would do before. Right? Like we're not a liar, but we will lie because we're afraid of the truth coming out and it hurting us. Right? Or we have never hurt somebody in our lives, but we will bring somebody pain if we are afraid that they're going to hurt us or hurt our family. Like it will lead us to steal. Right? We've never stolen anything, but if we're afraid we're not going to have enough food, then we will steal to protect ourselves. We'll do all sorts of different things out of fear, things we would never imagine doing. And it makes us feel pretty imperfect. It makes us feel like we are doing something so different than who we are. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Because if you've ever done that, if you've ever done something that compromised your beliefs out of fear, then you are not alone. Because we're going to look at an example in the Bible that I would say is absolutely almost unbelievable what happens in this story. We're going to look at a man who is an incredibly amazing person who does something absolutely terrible because of fear. We're going to look at the story of Abraham. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Abraham, Abraham is like one of those pinnacle figures in the Bible. I mean, he is like the guy that everybody wants to be like. He is the father of faith in Scripture. Let's just look at a few verses that describe Abraham. Here's one of them. It's talking about Abraham, and it says, "You will no longer be called Abram." He started off with the name Abram. It says, "You no longer will be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." In other words, what God is saying here is God is going to start whole nations from this guy because his faith is so strong. I mean, this guy is revered so much that when they give Jesus his ancestors, they make sure to trace him back to Abraham because they want him to be connected to this pillar of faith. Here's another thing about Abraham. It says, "And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness." And look at what he was called. He was called God's friend. I mean, you've got to be somebody pretty amazing to be called God's friend. That is not a title they give out very easily. In fact, he's, I think, the only person in the entire Bible referred to as God's friend. So Abraham's a pretty amazing guy. And yet Abraham makes an absolutely terrible mistake out of fear. And that's what we're going to look at. So we're going to look at a story of Abraham from the book of Genesis. For those of you who may not be familiar with this, Genesis is the first book of the Bible. It tells the story of us and our relationship with God and how that all got its beginning. The very word Genesis means the beginning, the origins of something. And so we're looking at the genesis of our relationship with God as told through the story of Abraham and his fear. And so let's look at what he does and what it says. So it says, now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. And as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, who also will be called Sarah, I know what a beautiful woman you are. That is a man who knows how to talk to his wife. He says, when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. And then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Now, this is an incredibly legitimate fear that he has here, that the Pharaoh will look at him and say, man, you got a beautiful wife. I want your wife as my own, and so I will kill you to get your wife. This is something that happened all the time. In fact, this is something that's even biblical. If you remember last semester, we talked about the story of David, this great king who stood on the top of his palace and said, everything that I see belongs to me. And what did he see? He saw a woman named Bathsheba. And he brought her over, and because he wanted to marry her and sleep with her and things like that, he had her husband killed. Well, that's exactly what this Pharaoh, Abraham at least is afraid that this Pharaoh is going to do to him. Take his wife, make her part of his own harem, and then kill him. And so he comes up with a plan. It says, say that you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for you, for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. So when Abraham came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was very beautiful, a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. In other words, she was made a part of his harem. In other words, she did that with Pharaoh. You ever hear of that MTV show, Pimp My Ride? Well, this is Pimp My Wife, right? And just like that show, it is terrible, right? Because this is a horrible thing he does here. I mean, look at what happens after he does this. It says the Pharaoh treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. In other words, Abram makes bank off of prostituting his wife to the Pharaoh. Like, what kind of man does that? And so we look and see what happens, because not everything is good in the end. It says, but the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. And so Pharaoh summoned Abram and said, what have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? And now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. And then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything that he had. So basically Pharaoh says, get him out of here. So here's this pinnacle of faith, this man who's referred to as a friend of God, this revered man who God chooses to form many nations out of. And what does he do? But he prostitutes his wife and profits off of it. Like, what kind of a guy does that? Why in the world would he do that? And you would think the story would end here. But no, it doesn't. Because a few years later, Abram goes to another land that has another ruler, and look at what it says. It says, now Abram moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar, and there Abram said to his wife Sarah, she is my sister, or said of his wife Sarah, she is my sister. And then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her to be his wife. He doesn't just pimp his wife once, he does it twice. Like, what kind of a guy does that? Why on earth would Abram do this? And I think we know the answer is actually pretty simple. He's afraid. He's afraid that he's going to die. He's afraid that they are going to kill him because of his wife. And so out of fear, he does something that he knows is absolutely terrible. How many times have we been tempted to do the same thing? How many times have we been tempted to compromise our integrity, compromise our morals, compromise our ethics because we were afraid of what might happen to us, because we were afraid that the truth might get out, because we were afraid of what other people might think of us? How many times have we denied God and denied ourselves and everything that matters to us because of fear? I mean, if you've ever done that, you don't need to feel guilty nevertheless, because you are in good company, right? We regret those things. They show our imperfection. The question is, how do we move past them? How do we move on to a life where we don't compromise when the going gets tough? We don't compromise because of fear. How do we keep ourselves strong in the face of it? Well, I think the interesting thing about this story is that when we look at Abram, we can learn not from what he did, but from what he didn't do. And when we focus on what he didn't do, it becomes very clear what we should do. So if you've got notes, I want to invite you to open them up right now. They're in your program. And I'm going to give you 3 lessons we learned from Abram. What he doesn't do that we should do when it comes to standing up against fear and not compromising. And here's the first one. Pray for God's plan. Pray for God's plan. I mean, when you think of this story, what is it that Abram does, right? Does he ever take a moment and stop and say, "Dear Lord, what do you want me to do?" Or, "Dear Lord, I know you brought me this far. Will you protect me?" Does he ever go to God at all? No. Instead, he comes up with his own plan. And it is a half-baked plan. It is a terrible plan. And yet the truth is that a lot of times we can fall into that same temptation. When we're afraid, we immediately try to construct a plan. We try to figure, how are we going to get ourselves out of this? But it ends up being a pretty bad plan most of the time compared to what God's plan is. It ends up being a little something like this video clip here.
We have to stop loaning.
How? I have a plan. You got a plan. Yes. First of all, you copied me for when I said I had a plan. I'm not. People say that all the time. It's not that unique of a thing to say. Secondly, I don't even believe you have a plan. I have part of a plan.
What percentage of the plan do you have?
You don't get to ask questions after the nonsense you pulled on nowhere.
I just saved Quill.
We've already established that you destroying the ship that I'm on is not saving me.
When did we establish?
Like 3 seconds ago!
I was listening. I was thinking of something else.
Oh,
She's right. You don't get an opinion. What percentage? I don't know. 12%. 12%? That's a big laugh. It's real! Totally fake. That is the most real, authentic, hysterical laugh of my entire life, because that is not a plan.
it's barely a concept.
You're taking their side?
I am Groot.
So what is better than 11%? What the hell does that have to do with anything? Thank you, Groot. Thank you. See? Groot's the only one of you who has a clue.
So many times when we are faced with a difficult situation and fears in front of us, just like Abram, we come up with a half-baked plan. I mean, Abram had a 12% plan. It was a half-baked plan. And we know that's true because any plan that involves prostituting your wife is not a good plan, right? And the same thing can happen to us. We just try to come up with our own ideas of what we need to do, and we fail to seek God. And whenever we do that, it's always going to fall short of a good plan. It's always going to be a 12% plan. And so the question is, then how do you seek God's voice? How do you know what God desires for you, what God's plan even is? Do you just sit there and wait for it to come to you? Or is there something you can do? And so I want to give you a few ideas of what you can do to be able to hear and experience what God's plan is in difficult situations when you face fear. And one of them is this: you can sit in silence. And I know that's not an easy thing to do. We live in an incredibly noisy world. And yet that's actually why silence might be so important. Because sometimes God is trying to speak to us, and yet we just don't have the ability to just sit and hear it, to get the silence. And let me tell you of a moment when I had to experience this myself. When Ignite first started, Ignite did not make it very long, right? In our first 6 to 8 months, by 6 to 8 months, we were done. Like, everybody who had joined us left. We had this one big exodus from some other people who left, and terrible things happened. And I found myself in this place of having picked up everything to move here, and then having it all fail within 6 to 8 months. And I remember in that moment, it was this dark period of time where I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know if I was called to this, if I was just a failure, if I should go on somewhere else. I mean, all of these things were running through my mind. And when I finally reached the end of my rope, when I just couldn't figure out what to do, I went to the Botanical Gardens in Norfolk, and I sat down on a bench, and I said, God, I am not leaving this place until you give me a plan. I'm not going to say a word. I'm not going to read scripture. I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to sit here until you give me a plan. And so I sat in silence for like 2 hours. And at the end of that, instead of actually getting a plan, I got a question. And that question was, Brandon, how are you going to start a church until you know what a church is? And it was that question that God asked me in that moment. And I don't know how to explain to you how I heard that. It's just one of those few moments in my life where I felt God speaking so profoundly. But it was that question that has changed everything about Ignite. Like the fact that we have a food pantry, the fact that we mentor kids, the fact that our whole process of doing things is what it is because of that moment where God asked that question. And I never would have heard it had I not been sitting in silence. And so maybe for you to hear God's voice and to be able to overcome this fear in your life, you need to just spend some time in silence. Or maybe you can do the next step, which is this. If you don't feel something's coming in silence, maybe you can spend some time in prayer. And this is kind of the whole point of it, right? Just to spend some time seeking God's guidance, seeking God's direction instead of your own. Another thing you can do is this. Fast. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what fasting is going without something. A lot of times it's food for a period of time. And every time you miss that thing, like every time you feel hunger pangs, you pray. And it's this thing that kind of forces you into prayer. It reminds you to pray. It's this sacrifice you give up to seek God's guidance. And I've had some incredible experiences in my life of periods of fasting that led to wonderful, wonderful outcomes. And so maybe that's something for you. Or there's the last one, and this a lot of times has to be the plan I go to after the other ones don't work. I create a plan and just get prepared for God to change it. Like come up with something, start moving, but always be listening for God to change your plans. Because that's the ultimate purpose about this, right? There's no magic trick to how to know what God's plan is. The key to all of this is to be listening, to be trying to hear God's voice, to seek God's guidance instead of your own guidance. And so the number one thing you can do is pray for a plan. Number two step that we learn in this is this. Confess. Confess. I mean, when you think about the story of Abram, one of the worst things he does, the whole root of all of this, is the fact that he does not confess his fear. Like, he just keeps up this ruse with his wife instead of just admitting that he is afraid and going and being honest with Pharaoh, or trying to be honest at least with himself and God about what is going on here. And a lot of times the big challenge that we face is that we are afraid to confess our fear. We're afraid to admit to it. We're afraid to let anybody else know about it, because we're afraid of how people might judge us and how they might look at us. But the problem is that you can't hold on to your fear and hold on to God's future at the same time. You can never heal from your fear and conquer your fear as long as you're holding on to your fear. You have to let it go. And let me give you an example here. So on this table, I've got two very, very different trays. One of these trays is filled with canned meat. This for me is like the pinnacle of terrible, right? I mean, you might like it, I'm not a fan, right? Now here's the thing, as I'm holding this can or whole tray of canned meat, how in the world can I hold that tray? See, on that tray are books and Rice Krispie treats and beef jerky and cheese puffs, what I basically call heaven on a platter right there. So how in the world do I pick up that tray if I'm still holding on to this tray? Because I can't hold this one-handed. It's too unstable. I've only got one option. I have to put it down. If I want something better, then I have to put down something worse. And that's the same thing in our lives when it comes to fear. If you want something better, then you have to put down something worse. If you want this better future, this taste of heaven that God promises us through Jesus, then you have to put down the worst thing. You have to let go of the fear, because you can't conquer your fear as long as you're holding on to your fear and keeping it secret. I mean, that's the whole idea behind confession. It is this admission that you don't have it all figured out, that you can't solve it all for yourself, that you need God and trust God more than you need and trust yourself. And so the question is then, what in your life is it that maybe you need to confess? What fear is it that you're afraid of getting out? What is it that terrifies you? And the healing is only going to come when you confess it. Like maybe for you've got some prejudice built up inside of you. I mean, you just see people, you've got anger, you've got hatred towards people that's just been there. And you're afraid of what anybody's going to think if you let it out. But the problem is that the only way you can deal with it is to actually get it out there and start dealing with it. Or maybe for some of you, you know people, or you're somebody who you have a drinking problem, right? Like you say to yourself, man, it's just college, I'm just having fun, it'll all end. But there's this part deep down inside of you that wonders if maybe it's something bigger. And the only way you're ever going to heal from it is actually to get it out there and start dealing with it. I mean, maybe you've got fear of trust and things like that, and you have to get that out there to be able to heal from that. Maybe you've got fear when it comes to your relationship with God, and you don't have it all figured out, and sometimes you don't know the answers. But the only way you're ever going to be around people who can help you is to confess that and put it out there where God can begin to work in it and begin to heal it. Because again, the purpose behind all of this is that you are trusting in God more than you are trusting yourself. You are letting go of your fear, letting go of something bad so that God can give you something better. So the second step is to confess your fears. Confess your fears. And then there's one other thing that you can do, and that's this. This is really important. Teach others about your mistakes. If you really want to overcome your own fear, one of the things you have to be able to do is to teach others about your mistakes. Teach others from your mistakes. If you could name one worst thing that Abram does in this whole story, it may not actually be prostituting his wife. It may actually be something that happens after this story is over. You see, after all of this happens, after Abram learns his lesson, not once but twice, he goes on and he moves and he has a family and all this other stuff. And eventually his son Isaac marries a woman named Rebecca, and they go to a foreign land that has a foreign leader. And check this out. When the men of that place asked Isaac about his wife, Rebecca, he said, "She is my sister," because he was afraid to say, "She is my wife." He thought the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebecca. Because what? Because she's beautiful. His son does the exact same thing. Like, how does that happen? How does he let that happen? How does he not have a conversation with his son at some point in his life and be like, "Let me tell you about the time I prostituted your mama"? Like, how does that never come up, right? But it's because of his fear, right? He's afraid to be vulnerable to his son. He's afraid to let out his own mistakes. And so his son follows in his footsteps. His son fails because he fails to help his son. And the problem is that that's not love. That's not what it means to love someone. You know, if we see someone going down a dark path and we see them about to fail, it's not judgment, it is love to correct them, right? To try to help them in that moment. I mean, think about it this way. I've got a 3-year-old daughter named Emma. Imagine that I'm walking down the street and I slip on ice and like bruise my elbow and break my arm or something. If I watch Emma walk behind me and start stepping on that ice and I don't say a word to her, is that loving her? Like, that's not judging her, that's loving her to tell her, no, stop, right? Here is my mistake, don't make it. Because the opposite is also true, right? Like, you can't say that you love someone if you watch them go through the same pain you've gone through and you do nothing about it. That's not love. And what God calls us to is a different kind of love, a bolder kind of love that is able to push through some of those fears of being called judgy to truly, truly love someone. The question, though, is how do you do it, right? Because you know you can't just walk up to somebody and be like, "Let me tell you what you need to do with your life." Like, none of us listens to that. So how do you do it? How do you love someone in a way that helps them not to make the same mistakes, that teaches them from your own mistakes, and not come across as incredibly judgmental? Well, there's a couple things you can do. One of them is that you have to catch them in a time of peace. You have to catch them in a time of peace. And what that means is you can't go to them in the heat of the moment, right? You can't go to them in that moment when they are drinking and you're trying to tell them they've got a drinking problem. You can't go to them in that moment when everything is crazy. You have to find them in a moment of peace where you can come to them calmly and kindly and say, hey, look, something on my heart has been concerned about you and I just need to talk to you about something and see what's going on. And as you begin to have that conversation, then you have to do the second step, which is this. Share your own mistake. Share your own mistakes. As you're having that conversation, say, look, I'm concerned with you, but I need you to know that I've made this mistake, right? I've been down this road. Here's what happened in my life. Here's the pain that it caused me. And because I love you, I don't want to see you hurt. I mean, that is very different than coming in and saying, man, look what you need to do. Look how you need to change because I'm morally superior than you. Those are very different things. And then you have to do the last thing, and this one's really important, and that's talk less and listen more. Talk less and listen more. And let me give you an example of when this happened. A couple months ago, I was talking to a girl, and she was telling me about these relationship problems that she was having and just how her relationship was terrible. The guy was just verbally abusive to her, and he was bad, and he cheated on her and all this other stuff, and she just wanted to get rid of him. And then like a month or so later, she comes back, and she tells me that they're going on a trip together. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, all I wanted to say is like, what are you thinking? He's ratchet. But then I remember that I don't even know what ratchet means, so I didn't do that. Right? And I also didn't do that because that's not the way you do that. Right? She's not going to hear me when I say that. And so instead, I asked her a question. I said, well, where are you going? And I remember when we talked a little while ago, you were having some trouble in the relationship. Has it gotten better? And I remember you said that he did some of these things to you. How is that? Has that changed? And if it hasn't changed, then what makes you want to still be in the relationship? And allow her to go down a path where she's answering those questions and she's getting that wisdom on her own. And if those moments come up where I can share, man, this was my experience, where I was in the same situation, then find that moment and listen for that moment. But listen less, right? Or listen more and talk less. Find those moments where he or she, whoever you're talking to, can be able to find that wisdom on their own without you preaching to them. And when you do that, you love them in an incredibly powerful way, because if we let people we love make the same mistakes at us as we did, then that's not love. And what God is calling us to do is be a different kind of community, a different kind of family, have a different kind of love. Because the truth is, we have all experienced fear. Right? I mean, we've known it since we were kids that we were going to be afraid of something. It is a natural thing to feel fear. The question is, what do we do with that fear and how do we handle it? Does it compromise us or do we control it? Is it a question of fear or faith that we're facing? I mean, I'll be honest with you. And this is something I haven't admitted to a lot of people in my life. What I'm doing right now terrifies me. Like, I know you might not think that. You might be like, well, he doesn't use notes and he seems like he can talk and he tells jokes that sometimes are funny. So like, right? But it terrifies me. I mean, the first time I preached, like I had everything written out word for word, and I did not even look up because I was just terrified I was gonna mess something up and look like an idiot. My hand was just shaking. Like you couldn't see it because I was behind this big podium, but it was just like this the whole time. It was like I was typing out Morse code of my sermon. I mean, it was crazy. And even today, like I don't have those same tics, I don't have those same things, but this terrifies me. Not because I'm afraid that I'm going to look foolish, like too late for that, but because I realize that I stand in front of people every single week who come into this room and their lives could be falling apart. Like there's some people who might walk in here who are going through a terrible breakup. There's other people who are scraping to just get by financially. There's some people who got some terrible news about their health or their family that is just tearing them up inside. And every single person who comes into this room looks to me for wisdom and hope and guidance. And that is an incredible opportunity, an incredible gift, and incredibly terrifying. And there are so many Sundays where I just want to look at that in the face of fear and run. Like I just want to read somebody else's message and hope they got it right. I just want to like not show up and sleep in and just hope James does it one Sunday. Like I just want to do something else. But I can't. Because that's not what God called me to do, and that's not who God called me to be. And every one of those moments is a question of fear or faith. Am I going to give into the fear? Am I going to hold on to the faith that God is bigger than me? And that's the question for you today. Where in your life do you have that wrestling match between fear and faith? Where is it that you just want to rely on yourself and yet you know you need to trust God? Where is it that you just need to pray for some guidance, to confess some fear, to share with somebody else so that they can learn from your mistakes and maybe you can learn from somebody else's mistakes? To love in a way that puts God above everything and trusts God above all things. Where do you need to do that in your life? And so as we wrap up, right, as we conclude today, I want to give you an opportunity to think about what that looks like. And so I'm just going to give you a few moments to pray. And we're going to have some music going in the background. In a few moments, our ushers are going to come forward. But I want you to spend some time today just thinking about where is it that you need to have faith? And what step can you take? I mean, maybe for you, it's spending some time in silence. Maybe for you, it is doing something that seems absolutely crazy. I mean, in just a moment, we're going to receive an offering, right? And for you, it could feel like a huge step of faith just to give a little bit to God in this moment and take that step in your own faith. Maybe that is a step for you. Maybe it's having a tough conversation with somebody. Maybe it's admitting something you don't want anybody to know. But take a moment, think about that. What is your plan for this week? And then in just a few moments, our ushers are going to come and receive that and receive our connection cards in our offering. We'll give you a moment to do that.